Stephen Harrison with us from the Broad Institute, and of course, I'm sure many of you are very familiar with Stephen. He is one of the chairs of the Sequence Variant Interpretation Working Group, and today he's going to be talking about ClinVar Miner. So thank you so much, Stephen.
Yes, thank you for having me. So yes, I'm going to go through. Let's see if I can put up my screen here. There we go. You can see my screen, right? The full size. Okay.
Yeah, looks good.
So I'm going to talk today about the ClinVar Miner tool, which is something that was developed, within ClinGen, was released maybe a year or so ago, maybe a little bit more than that. Here's the publication for it, which we can send out afterwards. This effort was led by Alex Henry from the University of Utah, and then Sarah Hemphill, who was here at the Laboratory for Molecular Medicine and have worked on ClinGen products as well. I have the PubMed ID up there as well. If you're interested in the paper goes through a lot of different use cases that the group had in mind as we were coming up with ClinVar Miner and sort of what we think people would want to do and how they can drill into the data and look at it. So it walks through a bunch of different use cases, most of which I'll go through today as well during this call. So overall, what is ClinVar Miner? So first of all, it does only contain information that comes directly from the ClinVar download. So there's nothing a ClinVar Miner that is, coming from other sources of some sort of supplemental information. And even when you get to the ClinVar Miner homepage, at the top it always says, when the last download was that they had used this data from. So they had taken the February of 2019 download from ClinVar to generate what you would see on the website now. So the sort of big picture for what ClinVar Miner is it allows you to sort of view and filter data from ClinVar in a way that may not be possible through the ClinVar web display of just certain types of use cases. Like if you want to see some high-level trends with regards to specific genes, like I want to see who all the submitters for this gene are and sort of what the breakdown of their classification types are, as well as like variant-specific filtering. Like I want to see medically significant differences in this gene, but specifically between this lab and this lab, and sort of be able to get down to, you could be a very broad case that you're looking for or very narrow, and hope to be able to get you to the right spot. So this is a screenshot from the ClinVar Miner homepage, and I have the URL up there at the top, clinvarminer.genetics.utah.edu. So as the way the website, sort of this homepage is generated is under three different sort of exploratory methods within the data set here. So either just a data exploration where you kind of would start by gene or variant. Another use case is looking at conflicts. So a bunch of different ways you could start with conflicts, whether by submitter or by gene, by clinical significance, and then high-level trends about sort of how many variants total are in ClinVar, how many submissions, where in the world are they from, what is the collection method listed under them. So again, sort of like big picture information about the data you would see in ClinVar. So we're going to start with the first sort of bucket, the data exploration. I'm specifically just going to look at sort of two different types under here, the variants by gene and variants by condition. And so what both these options would be is that you could use this to find all variants that either within your gene or condition, be able to look at a spectrum of classifications for whatever your query was, look at who are the submitters for this gene or condition within ClinVar, as well as what type of conflicts are there within this gene or disease. So I'm going to start by, if you had clicked on the variants by gene, what you first would get is this picture here where it's going to list. I cut off the list here, but what the gene or gene combination is, how many variants are within that gene, how many different conditions have been listed for that gene in ClinVar, and how many submitters are there. So here I had sorted it by variants, so to show which genes have the most number of variants within ClinVar. So you can see Titin is the gene that actually has the most, and then BRCA2, BRCA1 after that. So this top section allows you to also do a filtration by, if you wanted to look specifically at how many variants are there that have a minimum review status of maybe expert panel or clinical lab. I only want to look at variants that have a collection method of clinical testing. And so it allows you to sort of play with different filters to see what you would get back. So here I'm just showing what it is, just straight up how many variants, no filtration or anything. And one thing I wanted to note is, for any time you're doing different queries within ClinVar Miner, there is always this download table as a spreadsheet option, which is helpful for, you know, you've gotten a list of variants that you're interested in and you want to be able to, like, annotate them and mark them up outside of the system. You can download, you know, the variants of interest into a spreadsheet and be able to follow up with them that way. So then filtering, kind of just showing now example, if I click the review status of I want to only see 1 star, so criteria provided and clinical testing are higher, you can see sort of the counts dropped for a few of these because now we're only looking at variants that have clinical testing or criteria provided submissions on them. So if you click into any gene, so here I clicked into RYR1, up at the top again I'll see, you know, with regards to variants in this gene, again I could set different filtrations for what variants I want to see within this gene. So just starting with no sort of filtration, I can get a breakdown of path versus likely path, uncertain significance, likely benign, risk factor, not provided, so all the different classifications of variants in this gene. So one thing that I wanted to note is, so they have this total count at the end for variants, and then you see all these, you know, counts for different classifications. So these are not necessarily submissions. It is each variant is counted once in each unique classification term for that variant. So, for example, if a variant had 3 classifications, all of which are pathogenic, that variant would be counted once under the pathogenic bucket. If it had a pathogenic, likely pathogenic, and VUS, they'd be counted once under each. So it's the sum of these will not always equal the total because the total is variance, and so you'll see some more counts of if you sum these all together versus just looking at the total. So just wanted to sort of preface what these counts actually are. And so one thing that's interesting is because you can, for each gene, sort of get this breakdown of classifications within each gene, you can then do interesting things like this, where you can look at, so here I took the top 12 genes in ClinVar, and then looked at what the breakdown was of their classification terms to be able to compare all these different ones together. So up here I have the legend for path, likely path, VUS, likely benign, and then NP is for a classification that is not provided. So you can see even, so these are, again, the 12 genes that have the most amount of variance in ClinVar. But you can see that they differ wildly in the breakdown of their classifications. So, for example, even though TSC2 is on the list of having, you know, one of the highest number of variants in this gene, over 33% of all the variants in this gene actually have a clinical significance of not provided. So that makes it a little more tricky to gather any information about these variants if there's not any classification or information about them. Additionally, let's say, you know, you could also look and say, you know, for Titan, 56% of their variants are VUS, which is considerably high. Same thing with POLE, where the VUS count is almost at 60%, and they have practically no path or likely path variants. Conversely, LDLR has the least amount of VUS variants within this gene and has the most path or likely path. So being able to sort of look at these big picture trends is helpful with you, you know, have a set of genes you're interested in, want to get an idea of the, you know, breakdown of classifications and how maybe, you know, your gene of interest compares to what's known about a different gene within ClinVar, and be able to do comparisons like this. So going back to, once I clicked into a gene, I could see this breakdown of the different variants and their classifications. So if I scroll down then, in this top button, in this top section again, I could filter by, you know, a minimum review status if I wanted. So if I, you know, only wanted to look at criteria provided clinical testing, I'm now looking at about 1,800 variants. If I then even want to add in, I only am interested in variants that have clinically significant conflicts. It drops down to now there are 27 variants in this gene that have clinically significant conflicts. And at any point, you could click on any of these hyperlinks for this bucket and be able to get taken to a screen that then would have the list of the variants of interest from whatever that field would be. So in this case, it was the 27 that have a medically significant difference. And again, you could download this spreadsheet if you wanted to. So going back again to sort of what this top part looks under RYR1, the breakdown of the classification terms. If I scroll down further on this RYR1 page or any of the gene pages, the next thing I see is a breakdown by conditions and even within each condition, what is the breakdown of variant classifications within this gene. So for RYR1, the most common condition that has been submitted is a not provided condition, followed by RYR1 related disorders, and so on. And within each one of these, you can see the breakdown of classification terms. So like this multi-mini-core disease has been used by multiple people, but never been called path or likely path, only VUS and lower. And so again, you can kind of get an idea as to what different diseases have been associated with this gene. So one thing to keep in mind, which I'll show in another slide as well, is ClinVar allows people to use multiple different ontologies to describe a disease. And so as you can look, a lot of these sound very similar, but because one lab chose to use Orphanet versus a different submitter used OMEM, a different used MedGen, that sometimes you can get subtle differences in the name, even though we kind of are meaning the same thing, like the malignant hypothermia susceptibility versus malignant hypothermia susceptibility to type 1, which are, probably people just can use different ontologies to describe these two, which is why they would look so similar. If you scroll down further on the page, you can then also see who are the submitters of variants in this gene and a breakdown of their classifications. And this is helpful, like let's say you're working in an expert panel and you're starting with a gene and you want to know, okay, who are the people who submit the most amount of variants within this gene so that I have an idea as to who to contact for information. But it's also helpful to see what their classifications are, because if lab has, a lot of variants from this gene in ClinVar, but all of them are VUS or lower, chances are they, are hitting up on this gene maybe from exome or genome studies and not specifically testing in a diagnostic setting for that gene. So again, it gives you an idea as far as, who might have more information that you could contact about variants in this gene versus some which, again, if they only have VUS or lower, maybe wouldn't have as much information for the gene that you're interested in. So yes, this is a helpful little table to be able to look at. So the next thing I was going to show is variants by condition, and it's very similar to by gene, except now you start with a condition instead of a gene, and you get essentially all the same tables. So if I just click into that variants by condition, here I've sorted it by all the conditions sorted from the amount of variants that use that condition on down. So the two most common conditions in all of ClinVar are not specified and not provided, which people typically use these conditions for VUS benigns or likely benigns, so it's not surprising that these are the most common. But then hereditary cancer predisposing syndrome is the most commonly used of the sort of not vague type here. But additionally, you can see, again, how many genes use this condition and how many submitters have used this condition. So, for example, this dilated cardiomyopathy 1G combined with limb-girdle muscular dystrophy is on over 5,000 variants in ClinVar, but only from a single submitter. So it's probably that, just one submitter put this together as a condition and was using it, whereas, other submitters have not structured the condition this way. So it's, again, helpful to sort of get a sense of, where these different conditions are coming from. If you click into any of these conditions, so in this case I've picked malignant hypothermia susceptibility, again, you're seeing a screen very similar to if you started with the gene. Up top, the different filtrations, if you want to look at specific scenarios in this gene, condition, and then also a breakdown of the classifications within this condition. Next, which is helpful, is a breakdown of the gene and clinical significance that use this condition. So both RYR1 and CACNA1S both reference malignant hypothermia, and you can see sort of the breakdown of their classifications within these genes that reference this condition. And then also looking at who the submitters are that use this condition as well, to get a sense, again, of sort of who's using these terms. So again, the one thing I had mentioned earlier is this issue with many diseases sound similar. So if I looked at that condition list and just searched for malignant hypothermia, these are all the different options I would be getting. Again, these top two are very similar, just the difference of a 1 in it. There's also a malignant hypothermia with no susceptibility added to it, and another where it's malignant hypothermia paired together with central core myopathy. So because there's this issue with conditions, I think it is more helpful to be doing these searches starting by a gene of interest instead of a condition, unless your condition is so specific that every ClinVar submitter uses it the same way. Otherwise, you would only be looking at a subset of all the data that you are probably interested in, as opposed to all the variants within that gene. So just a heads up about using conditions for filtration and looking at ClinVar data. All right, so the next sort of bucket I was going to look at is the conflict exploration. And so this is to help labs, as their labs or even expert panels or anyone look for conflicts within either genes of interest or starting by a submitter. If you work in a specific lab and you want to see, I want to look at all the conflicts that my lab has with another lab or my lab has with an expert panel, you'd be able to use these approaches to get to the variants of interest for your filter. So the two in this bucket I'm going to talk about are the variants in conflict by gene and then variants in conflict by submitter. So starting with sort of the gene search, if you just click that variants in conflict by gene, you'd see again the thing you see above the breakdown of how you want to define a minimum set to look at of conflicts, which I'll explain a bit in another screen, and then a breakdown of different types of conflicts, and then further down is now each gene with all the different types of conflicts. So the way that they have these searches set up is the first column is just variants that only have one submission, so there's not going to be a conflict for those, and then variants that have at least 2 submissions and no conflicts. This next set is all the different types of conflicts. So the sum of the variants of conflicts are seen here, but then this is sort of the subset of this 902, which buckets they go into. So there could be a synonymous conflict, which what this means is in the past there were some people who had submitted to ClinVar using non-standard terminology that was then remapped to a standard term. So this is saying like a conflict and somebody said likely pathogenic and someone said presumably pathogenic. So things like that actually you wouldn't really see in the web display anyway. The next type is confidence differences, so a benign versus a likely benign or likely path versus path, again, which isn't reported as a conflict in ClinVar. Then you have VUS versus benign or likely benign counts, followed by variants with a category conflict. And so what they mean here is any conflict of someone using one of the standard ACMG terms versus a non-standard, non-remap term. So like risk factor versus benign or drug response versus pathogenic. So more of a category of non-ACMG versus an ACMG term. And then the last field is this variance with a clinically significant conflict. So these are your path or likely path versus VUS likely benign or benign type. And since you have all these little counts here, you can do some interesting sort of looking at all the different genes to get a sense of, do some genes have more conflicts than others? What's the breakdown of how common conflicts are in this gene? So in order to do these kind of approaches, one thing they can sort of keep in mind is the variance with at least 2 submitters and no conflicts plus variance with any kind of conflict equals all the variants within this gene that have 2 or more submitters. So anything that has multiple submitters is this column plus this column, and then those 2 plus variance with only 1 submission is your total variance within that gene. So with those in mind, you can then, again, do some interesting breakdowns of different genes. So showing here, again, these are the top 10 genes by how many clinically significant conflicts there are within each gene. And so first I decided just to break out and say, within each one of these genes, what % of all their variants have only 1 submitter versus what % of all their variants have multiple submitters. So interestingly, BRCA1 and BRCA2, there are actually more variants with multiple submitters than variants with only a single submitter. which makes sense considering these genes have been sequenced so many times and looked at that, there's going to be, multiple labs will have observed the same variant. And so those two are the only ones on this list where actually there is more multiple submitters than single. Whereas alternatively, Titan and FBN1 have the highest on the counts for variants with only one submitter. So for something like Titan, this would make sense because it's such a huge gene and everyone has variants in it that, there's less likely that you would find multiple submitters for one gene versus having only a single submitter, or multiple submitters for a variant as opposed to only one. So again, you can do sort of interesting searches by looking just overall big picture information about genes by looking at tables like this. Additionally, you could do a breakdown of how common are medically significant differences within any of these genes. So again, looking at that same list of 10 genes that have the most amount of clinically significant differences, and then adding percentages to show of all the variants that have multiple submitters, what percent are clinically significant differences, and what percent of their total variants are variants with clinically significant differences. So interesting, again, BRCA1 and 2, even though they have some of the highest numbers of clinically significant conflicts, it represents a very small percent. Also, only 3% of all variants in BRCA1 that have multiple submitters have conflicting interpretations, and only 2% of all variants within this gene have clinically significant differences. Whereas something like BTD has 42% of all their variants with multiple submitters are conflicting. So it's a smaller set, but there's seems to be enriched for clinically significant differences. So we'll put the ones with the highest in blue versus the lowest in yellows. So again, to show even though these are all the ones with the highest numbers of clinically significant conflicts, when you take into account how many variants there are within this gene total, you can see that a lot of them have a much lower actual percent that are conflicting when you take that into account.
Is it possible to ask a question at this point?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It's just about BTD, which I think is the biotinidase gene.
Yes.
And I just wondered if that's because there's newborn screening for that in the States and in many countries, and whether a lot of things are being picked up that aren't pathogenic variants, and maybe that's why there are conflicts. Is that possible?
Yeah, that could be. That there's and in this screen I didn't do filtration by submitter type, so it could be that also some of this is old literature data about this gene, where maybe it was historically thought pathogenic, but now with newborn screening we have enough information to realize it's not pathogenic anymore. But yeah, that's a good question. I'm not exactly sure why.
I'm a bit surprised because it's an ultra-rare disease and yet it's in your top 10, so I just was a bit surprised by that. Yes, thanks. Sorry for interrupting.
Oh, no. Oh, I mean, yes, anyone feel free to ask questions at any time. No worries about that. So if you want to then dive into any specific gene, you can click on it from the list or even search it within ClinVar Miner. And you, again, we'll get the screen that shows the breakdown. So within this gene, there are 1,275 variants with only one submission, the 436 with multiples and no conflicts, and then 771 with any kind of conflict. Further down is then this significance breakdown table, which gives you all the different scenarios of conflicts. So if you have a specific scenario in mind, you can look just at that variant type. So for example, there are 11 variants that one submitter has called pathogenic, that another submitter has called benign. So that would be surprising. And so if you clicked on this 11 or any of these numbers, again, you'd get taken to a screen. I think I have that. Nope. A screen that would then just list those variants so you could actually get the list of what these variants are to be able to pursue them further. So let's say within LDLR now, instead of just looking at any variant in the gene that could have conflicts, you want to look only at criteria-provided clinical testing versus criteria-provided clinical testing. So only conflicts, between clinical labs, and now you're only interested in clinically significant conflicts. So again, path or likely path versus anything lower. And then you can see, so from the count, there are 70 variants in this gene that have a clinically significant conflict between clinical testing labs. And then again, with the breakdown of all the different scenarios here. So even though on that previous screen I had said there was 11 pathogenic versus benign, that was against any submitter type, whereas if you're looking at just clinical labs, there's only 2 that are pathogenic versus benign differences. And again, if you click on that 2, you'll be taken to a screen where you can then actually see what those variants are, and then you could either download it or use that information from there. Okay, so the next type of conflict I was going to look at is conflicts by submitter. So if you start by clicking on conflicts by submitter, you'll just get a list of all the different submitters and how many overall conflicts they have, again, sort of sorted into all these different buckets that you can sort if you have a specific scenario in mind you want to be looking at. So if you wanted to do a search specifically starting with one lab, you would just need to click on the lab's name. So in this case, I'll click on Laboratory for Molecular Medicine, and now be taken to a screen that is just showing specifically, starting with Laboratory for Molecular Medicine, what conflicts does this submitter have against others. So there's this table below. So all of the terms here on the y-axis would be the classifications from Laboratory for Molecular Medicine, and then all other submitters appear across the x-axis. And you can then see different scenarios of, there are 2 variants that we've called pathogenic that someone else has called benign, and be able to dive into some of these scenarios. If you then, so if I'm still on the Laboratory for Molecular page here, if I scroll down further after this significance breakdown table, is then a table that compares us to other submitters, and is sorting by how many conflicts now specifically between the submitter I started with and then any other submitter is listed here. So if you could sort to see which ones you have the most amount of conflicts with, either just overall conflicts or maybe specifically, clinically significant ones. If you wanted to run a comparison looking at one lab specifically to another, so in this case, let's say I want to compare the Laboratory of Molecular Medicine to Ambry, I would just have to click on Ambry at this screen. Oh, yep, click on Ambry on this screen. And now I'm looking at variants with conflicting interpretations between Laboratory for Molecular Medicine and Ambry genetics. And then I can see again sort of this breakdown table of looking now just at LMM versus Ambry, whereas the previous screen was LMM versus any lab, and be able to understand what the conflicts between these 2 labs are, and dive into any of these deeper if you have a specific conflict type you're interested in. So another thing you could do is actually look at conflicts within yourself. So if instead of clicking on Ambry on that other screen, this Laboratory of Molecular Medicine, was listed against itself. So this is a way to determine if we ever accidentally submitted multiple variants within one gene and had different classifications on them. As you can see, there are a few where we've called a variant path and likely path and a variant path in VUS. And some of these maybe are intentional because we're looking at different conditions. But this is just a way where you can sort of see if, even within one submitter, if they have conflicts with themselves. And that could be an interesting thing to dive into if you're a person who submits to ClinVar to see if you have any conflicts like this. Another thing you can do is compare the submitter of interest against another review status. So instead of saying I want to only look at LMM versus another lab, what if I want to look at Laboratory for Molecular Medicine specifically compared to anything that is reviewed by an expert panel in ClinVar to understand how often we differ from an expert panel interpretation in ClinVar. So then it generates, again, these different counts for all the different conflict types, and then this significance breakdown. So you can see there is one variant in ClinVar that we call pathogenic that an expert panel calls uncertain significance. And we could then click into that one variant and be able to figure out what could be going on there. Additionally, if you were an expert panel, you could also start with yourself and see how you compare to other submitters in ClinVar to get a sense of if there is maybe any data that's out of date or variants that you would want to look into where you're differing from a different submitter. So here I pulled up Enigma, which does interpretations in BRCA1 and 2, an expert panel in ClinVar. And this is the breakdown just of them compared to any submitter in ClinVar for their classification terms versus the other submitters. But they could also limit this to only wanting to look at their interpretations versus just anything that's 1 star. So, maybe they aren't interested in comparing their conflicts against OMEM or any research group, but want to look specifically at clinical testing type or criteria provided type. They could then, now this table has refreshed, and you see counts specifically for this scenario of comparing Enigma versus only other criteria provided submitters. And you can see, so they have 9 that are, the laboratory has called pathogenic, Enigma called pathogenic, that a criteria provided calls VUS. Also, there is 1 variant that the expert panel calls benign that a clinical testing lab calls pathogenic. So that would be a bit alarming, and the lab or expert panel would probably want to look into that to see what could be causing that conflict. Oh, and again, if I clicked on that 1, it would take me to the screen where it's reminding me that I'm looking specifically at variants that are benign from Enigma and pathogenic from any submitter, and then I can go click into this variant, and it does link through to ClinVar as well if you click through that hyperlink to then be able to see the variant in ClinVar as well. All right, so the last type I was going to talk about is going through these high-level trends. So again, more big picture information about ClinVar with regards to how many submissions are in there, what's the breakdown of collection method, where in the world are submissions coming from, to get just sort of more aggregate information about ClinVar. So we looked at total submissions by collection method. You can see there's this chart that shows sort of the ClinVar history from, oh, it blocked the number so I can't see the bottom, but I think 2013 up through 2019, with the total number of submissions here in blue, and then all the different collection methods seen below. There's also then a table that summarizes it below this. So of the over 778,000 submissions to ClinVar, clinical testing represents almost 89% of all the different submissions that you would see in ClinVar, followed by then literature only having the second most common collection method. And so sort of interesting, you can see over time how much, the data set has grown, specifically even within the last 2 years compared to previous, of just how big ClinVar has grown and how many submissions it's getting as time goes on. Again, you could also look at a breakdown by submissions from countries. So the shading here is representing how many submissions they've had from each country into ClinVar, but then there's also a table that summarizes by country how many submissions have gone. And so if you're curious about if a certain country has submitted data to ClinVar or wanted to look at a certain subset, you could get a sense of where the where data overall in ClinVar is coming from by looking at this graph. And I believe ClinVar has a similar map on their website as well that shows where all the different submissions are coming from, so that we can see if we have a global impact on classifications or not. All right, so that was all I had. I just wanted to again acknowledge the authors of the paper who had worked on this, especially Alex Henry and Sarah Hemphill, who had led the efforts. Alex from University of Utah and Sarah from Laboratory for Molecular Medicine and ClinGen, who had worked on this. And yes, that's all I had. So I'm happy to take any questions about ClinVar Miner. And again, we can send out the paper afterwards as well if people are interested in looking at that. Any questions?
Questions for Stephen? Everyone's quiet today.
Or everyone gets off early. So I would recommend, if you're at all interested, just going to the website and clicking around. You can, there's a lot you can learn just by even playing around with different searches. If you have your favorite gene, go put it in there, and you can see, again, the breakdown of classifications and who is submitting on it, and just sort of get a better overall sense of what's known about that gene in ClinVar.
Great. Well,